You're a palace guard in the corridors of Versailles, and the year is 1774. The king is dead, but your duties have only just begun. You've been summoned to the private apartments of the late Louis XV for a task so extraordinary, so unprecedented that you question whether you've somehow slipped into a fever dream. The royal physician stands before you with trembling hands and a request that makes your blood run cold. Your fingers shake as you approach the ornate bed where Louis's body lies in state. Even in death, the man who ruled France for nearly 60 years seems to mock the very concept of mortality from beyond the grave. But it's not his face that commands your attention. It's what lies beneath the silk coverlets. The thing that defined his reign as much as his wars, his mistresses, or his catastrophic finances. The anatomical peculiarity that courtiers would whisper about in dark corners, but never dare mention in official records. Louis XV, the most Catholic king, his bizarrely oversized and grotesquely misshapen anatomy that was simultaneously the source of his legendary prowess with women and his most carefully guarded secret. As you begin the preservation process, your mind wanders to the stories you've heard echoing through the palace halls. Stories of specially designed furniture, of terrified noble daughters, of desperate attempts to satisfy an appetite that seemed to grow more monstrous with each passing year. You realize you're not just preserving flesh and bone. You're preserving the physical embodiment of a reign that was itself excessive, oversized, and ultimately destructive to everything it touched. Before diving into these forgotten stories of absolute power and its most intimate corruptions, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider hitting that like button and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it incredible that we're exploring these ancient stories together from different parts of the world, connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. To understand Louis XV, you must first understand that he was born into a world where royal blood was considered divine, where the king's body was literally viewed as sacred, and where even the most private aspects of royal anatomy carried political significance. The French Bourbons had spent generations carefully managing their bloodline, but unlike their Habsburg cousins, they had avoided the worst excesses of inbreeding. Louis emerged from this lineage like a genetic lottery winner, at least on the surface. Born at the Palace of Versailles on February 15, 1710, he was the great-grandson of Louis XIV, the Sun King himself. His parents, Louis, Duke of Burgundy, and Marie Adelaide of Savoy, were a couple whose marriage represented the pinnacle of French royal breeding strategy. The genetic dice had been cast with precision, and Louis would benefit from this careful planning in ways that would both elevate and ultimately doom his reign. As he grew from child to adolescent, it became clear that nature had bestowed upon the future king gifts that went far beyond mere royal bearing. His anatomy began developing in ways that exceeded all normal expectations, creating what court physicians would later describe in their private notes as a royal endowment of truly unprecedented proportions. By his teenage years, the palace physicians were already documenting the prince's extraordinary condition, an organ so massive and unusually configured that it seemed to belong more to legend than to medical reality. Contemporary medical records, hidden away in the archives of the Faculty of Medicine in Paris for centuries, describe Louis's endowment in clinical terms that nonetheless convey the awe-inspiring nature of his condition. One physician wrote, "His Majesty possesses an organ of such remarkable dimensions and singular configuration that intimate relations require careful preparation and specialized knowledge." Another was more direct in his assessment. The king's member resembles nothing so much as a cavalry saber, curved and imposing, measuring in excess of 12 inches in its natural state, and achieving even more formidable proportions when aroused. The psychological impact on young Louis was profound, but unlike Ferdinand VII's shame and paranoia, Louis embraced his anatomical gift as a divine sign of his royal superiority. In an era when male virility was directly connected to political power, Louis's massive endowment became a source of supreme confidence and entitlement. The very thing that modern men might envy became the foundation of Louis's belief in his absolute right to rule and to take whatever he desired. Louis's childhood was a masterclass in absolute monarchy that would shape him into history's most sexually voracious ruler. His great-grandfather, Louis XIV, had established the template of royal magnificence and sexual conquest, but the Sun King's appetites were modest compared to what young Louis would develop. The court of Versailles buzzed with anticipation about the prince's development. Servants gossiped excitedly, courtiers made respectful inquiries, and foreign diplomats reported back to their masters about the French marvel. Louis learned early that he was an object of fascination and desire, that his most intimate attributes were a source of wonder rather than shame. This knowledge bred a confidence that would later manifest in his treatment of women, nobles, and indeed all of France. The prince began to see admiration everywhere, in the respectful gazes of his tutors, in the nervous excitement of potential partners, in the awed whispers of those who glimpsed his naked form during formal dressing ceremonies. The prince's tutors noticed remarkable changes in his behavior as he entered adolescence. He became bold, commanding, and irresistibly charismatic to those who served him. Louis was learning to use the power of his position in combination with his extraordinary physical attributes to command absolute obedience from those around him. One particular incident recorded in the secret memoirs of a court chaplain reveals the growing confidence in Louis's character when a young duchess accidentally encountered the prince in his bath. Rather than showing embarrassment, Louis stood proud and unashamed, allowing her to look her fill before dismissing her with a smile that promised future encounters. As Louis reached sexual maturity, the full extent of his anatomical magnificence became clear to the royal physicians. Dr. Antoine Fagon, the king's personal doctor, left behind detailed notes that provide a fascinating window into the medical reality of Louis's condition. His Majesty's organ, Fagan wrote, presents a most extraordinary configuration of divine perfection. The base measures the circumference of a woman's wrist, yet it expands to dimensions that challenge natural proportion. The length exceeds that of any recorded human specimen, measuring near to 13 inches in its aroused state. Most remarkable is the elegant curvature and the presence of distinctive ridges that appear designed by Providence itself for maximum feminine satisfaction. The implications for Louis's future as a lover were immediately obvious. Normal, intimate relations would require careful preparation and willing partners, but the rewards promised to be beyond anything previously recorded in royal annals. The palace craftsmen were secretly commissioned to create what they euphemistically called comfort aids, specially designed cushions and supports that would allow Louis to engage in extended, intimate encounters without fatigue. But unlike Ferdinand's desperate medical interventions, these devices were crafted as accessories to pleasure rather than necessities for basic function. The physical magnificence was only part of Louis's transformation into France's most legendary lover. His condition had psychological ramifications that went far beyond the bedroom, creating a monarch who viewed all of life as his personal pleasure garden. He became convinced that his extraordinary anatomy was proof of divine favor, that God had marked him for greatness in all things, especially in the conquest of women. The prince spent his teenage years studying erotic arts with the same dedication other royals devoted to statecraft. In 1725, at the age of 15, Louis was married to Marie Leszczyńska, a Polish princess 7 years his senior. The match was arranged by his chief minister, but Marie arrived in France with romantic hopes about her young husband. She had heard he was called the Well-Beloved by his subjects, and imagined herself marrying a fairy tale prince. The wedding ceremony was magnificent, as befitted the union of the King of France with foreign royalty. The cathedral echoed with music, the streets of Paris rang with celebration, and the young couple appeared to be the perfect royal partnership. Marie was intelligent, devout, and genuinely excited about her new life. Louis, for his part, seemed appropriately respectful in public, charming, attentive, and every inch the young king. But royal weddings end and wedding nights begin, and it was in the privacy of the royal bedchamber that Louis's true nature would be revealed. The first sign of what awaited Marie came when the king's valet approached her ladies-in-waiting with unusual preparations. Special arrangements were needed for the royal bed, equipment that the ladies didn't understand but were assured was customary for royal couples of Louis's particular gifts. Custom oils were brought in, along with silk cushions and various implements that seemed more suited to celebration than to intimidation. Marie, sheltered and innocent as most royal brides of her era, understood little of what awaited her. Her education had focused on languages, music, and religious devotion, with only the vaguest hints about marital duties provided by nervous older women who themselves had no conception of what she was about to experience. When Louis entered the bridal chamber, Marie's first glimpse of her husband's naked form sent her into a state of shocked amazement rather than terror. One lady-in-waiting, writing years later, described the scene. Her Majesty gazed upon the king with the wonder of one witnessing a miracle. She whispered, "Mon Dieu," repeatedly, though whether in prayer or amazement, none could say. Louis's member, described by witnesses as resembling a royal scepter of impossible proportions, was unlike anything the sheltered princess had ever imagined. The sheer size inspired awe, but it was the elegant curve and the obvious pride with which Louis displayed himself that truly captured her attention. What followed was less a traditional wedding night than an initiation into pleasures beyond mortal comprehension. Louis's specially trained physicians had briefed him extensively on techniques for managing his extraordinary endowment, and the young king approached his marital duties with the confidence of one blessed by providence. The custom cushions were arranged, the oils applied, and a process began that lasted through the night and into the following day. Contemporary accounts hidden in private letters between court physicians describe scenes of unprecedented royal satisfaction. Louis's approach required specially designed supports to bear his weight during intimate relations, but rather than medical necessity, these served to enhance endurance and intensity. The king had developed techniques that could sustain pleasure for hours, and Marie found herself experiencing sensations that left her speechless for days afterward. The psychological impact on both partners was transformative in entirely opposite ways from Ferdinand's disasters. Louis, already confident about his condition, became convinced of his divine right to unlimited pleasure. Marie, meanwhile, developed what modern psychologists would recognize as an addiction to her husband's attentions. Their attempts to produce heirs became ritualized celebrations that occurred with religious regularity. Louis would summon his physicians, who would prepare the chamber with its specialized equipment not for medical intervention but for maximum pleasure. Marie would be prepared with oils and relaxation techniques designed to help her accommodate her husband's magnificent proportions. The encounters would continue for hours, after which both parties would retreat to separate wings of the palace to recover, Louis from exertion and Marie from overwhelming satisfaction. Over the course of their marriage, Marie bore Louis 10 children, a testament to both the king's fertility and his remarkable stamina. The court became accustomed to the Queen's regular periods of exhausted satisfaction, and physicians noted that Marie's health actually improved during her childbearing years, as if the King's attentions provided some sort of vital energy that sustained her well-being. But Louis's extraordinary capabilities created an appetite that one woman, even a devoted wife, could not hope to satisfy. As Marie aged and her childbearing years ended, the king began looking beyond his marriage for outlets worthy of his divine endowment. This was when the true legend of Louis XV as lover began to emerge, transforming Versailles into the most sexually charged court in European history. The king's first major mistress was Louise Julie de Mailly-Nesle, a young countess whose beauty was matched only by her curiosity about the rumors surrounding His Majesty's legendary proportions. When Louis first took her to his private chambers, Louise was prepared for romance, but utterly unprepared for the reality of the king's anatomy. Her first encounter left her bedridden for 3 days, not from injury, but from what court physicians delicately termed overwhelming feminine satisfaction. Louise's relationship with Louis lasted for several years, during which she became something of a legend herself for her ability to accommodate the king's needs. Palace servants noted that special furniture had to be constructed for their encounters, reinforced beds and chairs designed to withstand the vigorous attentions of a king blessed with divine proportions. Louise herself became almost evangelical about her royal lover, writing to friends about experiences that bordered on the religious in their intensity. But even Louise's remarkable tolerance had its limits, and as the relationship progressed, she began showing signs of what modern medicine would recognize as chronic fatigue syndrome brought on by the impossible demands of satisfying a lover whose appetites matched his extraordinary anatomy. Court physicians noted that Louise required increasing amounts of rest between encounters with the king, and her ladies-in-waiting reported that she often spent entire days in bed recovering from royal attentions. Louis, meanwhile, interpreted Louise's occasional need for rest as a limitation on his divine right to pleasure, and his eyes began wandering to other possibilities. The king's sexual appetite had grown to match his anatomical capabilities, creating a monarch whose need for intimate satisfaction exceeded even the considerable abilities of his devoted mistresses. This was when Louis began developing what would become known as the Versailles system, a rotating schedule of mistresses designed to ensure that royal desires never went unsatisfied. The system began informally, with Louis maintaining relationships with several women simultaneously, but it quickly evolved into an organized structure that rivaled the complexity of the French government itself. The king appointed what amounted to a minister of royal pleasure, whose job was to identify, recruit, and schedule women capable of meeting His Majesty's extraordinary needs. The position required diplomatic skills, as many of the potential candidates were married nobles whose husbands needed to be convinced or compensated for their wives' royal service. The most famous of Louis's systematic conquests was Jeanne Antoinette Poisson, better known as Madame de Pompadour, a woman whose intelligence matched her beauty and whose ambition exceeded both. When Pompadour first encountered the king's naked form, her reaction was notably different from his previous lovers. Rather than shock or overwhelming satisfaction, she displayed a calculating assessment that impressed Louis almost as much as her physical attributes. Here was a woman who viewed the king's extraordinary endowment not as an obstacle to be overcome or a divine experience to be endured, but as a tool of power to be mastered. Pompadour approached her relationship with Louis like a military campaign, studying his preferences, developing techniques for managing his proportions, and building her tolerance through careful preparation and expert medical consultation. She commissioned the finest physicians in France to advise her on methods for accommodating the king's needs while maintaining her own health and stamina. The result was a partnership that lasted for nearly 20 years and transformed both the sexual politics of Versailles and the governance of France itself. Under Pompadour's influence, the king's bedroom became an extension of the throne room, where political decisions were made between sessions of royal pleasure. Foreign ambassadors learned that the best time to approach the king with important proposals was immediately after his encounters with Pompadour, when His Majesty was in a state of satisfied benevolence that made him amenable to almost any suggestion. The woman who could satisfy Louis XV's legendary appetite had effectively become the shadow ruler of France. But even Pompadour's remarkable abilities had their limits, and as she aged, she began experiencing the same fatigue that had claimed her predecessors. The king's needs remained constant while her capacity gradually diminished, creating a crisis that threatened their political partnership as much as their personal relationship. It was Pompadour herself who proposed the solution that would define the final phase of Louis's reign: the establishment of what became known as the Parc aux Cerfs, a private residence where the king could maintain a rotating staff of young women specifically recruited and trained for royal service. The Parc aux Cerfs represented the ultimate evolution of Louis's sexual system, a carefully managed operation that provided the king with a constant supply of partners while protecting the political relationship with Pompadour. Young women, typically from bourgeois families, were selected for their beauty, health, and adaptability, then provided with extensive training in the specialized techniques required for satisfying a monarch of Louis's extraordinary proportions. The facility employed physicians, trainers, and even what amounted to sexual engineers who developed new furniture and techniques for managing the king's anatomical challenges. The women of the Parc aux Cerfs lived in comfortable luxury, provided with education, medical care, and generous financial support in exchange for their availability to His Majesty. Many bore the king's children, adding dozens of royal bastards to the already complex genealogy of the Bourbon dynasty. The king visited the facility regularly, sometimes daily, treating it as a necessary component of royal health maintenance rather than mere pleasure-seeking. But the establishment of the Parc aux Cerfs marked the beginning of Louis's decline from beloved monarch to object of public ridicule and resentment. The French people, initially proud of their king's legendary virility, began to see his sexual appetite as excessive and expensive. Maintaining the facility, supporting his various mistresses, and providing for his numerous bastard children cost the treasury enormous sums at a time when France was struggling with mounting debt and social unrest. Political pamphlets began circulating that mocked the king's priorities, suggesting that he was more interested in satisfying his anatomy than governing his kingdom. These publications, known as libelles, often included crude drawings and detailed descriptions of the king's proportions, transforming what had once been a source of royal pride into a subject of national embarrassment. The same anatomical gift that had made Louis a legend was now being used as evidence of his unfitness to rule. The king's response to this criticism revealed how thoroughly his sexual obsessions had corrupted his political judgment. Rather than scaling back his activities or addressing the legitimate concerns of his subjects, Louis doubled down on his pleasure-seeking, expanding the Parc aux Cerfs and adding new mistresses to his rotation. He seemed to believe that his extraordinary anatomy gave him the right to unlimited indulgence, regardless of the cost to France or the welfare of his people. Meanwhile, the women who served the king's needs began experiencing the same fatigue and health problems that had plagued his earlier mistresses. Despite the careful medical supervision and training provided at the Parc aux Cerfs, the simple reality was that no human body could indefinitely accommodate Louise's extraordinary demands. Turnover at the facility increased as women retired due to exhaustion, and recruitment became more difficult as word spread about the physical challenges of royal service. Louis's final mistress, Jeanne Bécu, better known as Madame du Barry, represented both the pinnacle and the nadir of his sexual career. A former prostitute with exceptional physical capabilities and no political ambitions beyond personal enrichment, Dewberry was recruited specifically for her ability to satisfy the aging king's still formidable needs. Her relationship with Louis lasted until his death, but it also marked the complete transformation of French royal sexuality from a symbol of divine authority to a source of national shame. The revolution that would ultimately destroy the Bourbon monarchy was fueled in part by popular resentment over Louis XV's sexual excesses. The image of a king who spent fortunes on sexual satisfaction while his people starved became a powerful symbol of royal decadence and corruption. Political revolutionaries used the king's anatomical obsessions as evidence that the monarchy itself was a perversion of natural order, a system that allowed one man's physical desires to override the needs of an entire nation. When Louis XV died in 1774, the official cause was listed as smallpox, but palace physicians privately acknowledged that the king had essentially exhausted himself through decades of sexual excess. His body, despite its extraordinary endowment, had finally succumbed to the accumulated stress of a lifetime spent in pursuit of pleasure beyond mortal limits. The autopsy, conducted in secret by royal physicians, revealed the full extent of the king's anatomical uniqueness, while also documenting the physical toll of his excessive lifestyle. The preserved organ, measuring an unprecedented 14.5 inches in length with proportional girth, was sealed away in the archives of the Faculty of Medicine in Paris, where it remains to this day. Church officials and government authorities deemed the material too politically sensitive for public knowledge, creating one of history's most carefully guarded state secrets. Scholars who have been granted access to these materials describe them as simultaneously awe-inspiring and deeply troubling, a window into the private obsessions of absolute power, unconstrained by moral or practical limits. Louis XV's death marked the end of an era, but his legacy lived on in the weakened France he left behind. His grandson, Louis XVI, inherited a kingdom bankrupted by his predecessor's excesses and a population radicalized by decades of royal indulgence. The French Revolution that would ultimately consume the monarchy was fueled in part by the popular memory of a king who had valued his personal pleasure above the welfare of his subjects. The story of Louis XV serves as a reminder that even divine gifts can become curses when pursued without wisdom or restraint. His reign demonstrated how individual obsessions can metastasize into national disasters, how private indulgence can become public scandal, and how the most intimate human desires can echo through history with consequences far beyond their original scope. Perhaps most importantly, Louis's story reveals the corruption inherent in absolute power, where the personal appetites of one man could determine the fate of millions, where anatomical accidents of birth could be interpreted as divine mandates for unlimited indulgence. The king's extraordinary endowment, which should have been a private matter between him and his partners, became a symbol of everything wrong with the old regime. His sexual appetite, which might have been manageable in a private citizen, became a political liability that helped bring down a 1,000-year-old dynasty. Louis XV had been blessed by nature with extraordinary capabilities, but cursed by circumstance with the power to pursue those capabilities without limit or consequence. As that palace guard in 1774 completed his grim task of preserving Louis's anatomical legacy, he must have reflected on the terrible irony of his situation. Here was the physical evidence of a reign that had consumed everything in its path: mistresses, treasury, and ultimately the monarchy itself. The preserved organ was more than a medical curiosity. It was a monument to the destructive power of unchecked desire, the corruption of absolute authority, and the tragic waste of extraordinary gifts. In the end, Louis XV achieved a kind of immortality, but not the kind he had sought. His name lived on not as a great lover or successful ruler, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal obsession to masquerade as royal prerogative. His anatomical legacy, hidden away in Parisian vaults, serves as a reminder that some gifts are too powerful for mortal men to wield responsibly, too intoxicating for absolute monarchs to resist, and too dangerous for any one person to possess without destroying themselves and everything they touch. The silk sheets that had once covered his extraordinary body now covered a kingdom equally corrupted, equally unable to function as nature intended. Louis XV had finally found peace, but he had left behind a France that would struggle for generations to recover from the intimate disasters of his self-indulgent reign. The most physically gifted king in French history had ended as he had lived, as a source of fascination and destruction for everyone unfortunate enough to be touched by his power. But the story of Louis XV's anatomical obsessions cannot be understood without examining the broader context of royal sexuality in 18th century Europe, where the king's bedroom was as much a political arena as the throne room itself. The French court had developed elaborate protocols around royal intimacy that transformed private acts into public spectacles, ceremonies that reinforced the divine nature of kingship while simultaneously exposing the very human appetites that drove royal behavior. The lever and cocher ceremonies, where nobles competed for the privilege of witnessing the king's morning rising and evening retirement, took on particular significance given Louis's extraordinary anatomy. These daily rituals, inherited from his great-grandfather Louis XIV, became opportunities for courtiers to glimpse the physical evidence of royal magnificence that had become legendary throughout Europe. The privilege of holding the king's nightshirt or presenting his morning robe carried additional weight when everyone understood what lay beneath the royal garments. Foreign diplomats reported extensively on these ceremonies, often spending more time describing the king's physical attributes than his political positions. The Venetian ambassador wrote in 1740, "His Most Christian Majesty possesses advantages that extend far beyond the merely political, creating a personal magnetism that affects all who serve in his presence." The Austrian envoy was more direct, noting that the French king's natural endowments inspire a loyalty that borders on worship among his female subjects. These diplomatic dispatches reveal how Louis's anatomical reputation had become a tool of international relations, with foreign courts either intimidated by or envious of the French king's legendary capabilities. Marriage negotiations between European royalty often included subtle inquiries about Louis's availability, as noble families sought to align themselves with a monarch whose virility promised both political alliance and genetic advantages for their daughters. The economic implications of Louis's sexual appetite extended far beyond the direct costs of maintaining mistresses and pleasure facilities. The king's reputation as an incomparable lover created a luxury industry devoted to serving royal sexuality. Furniture makers specialized in reinforced bedroom equipment. Textile workers produced specially designed linens capable of withstanding royal encounters, and even jewelers created intimate accessories designed to enhance pleasure between the king and his partners. The Palace of Versailles itself was gradually modified to accommodate Louis's lifestyle, with secret passages constructed between royal apartments and mistress quarters, soundproof chambers installed to contain the king's vigorous activities, and entire wings converted into what amounted to elaborate pleasure complexes. These architectural modifications required enormous expenditures at a time when France was struggling with mounting debt, but Louis viewed them as essential infrastructure for maintaining royal prerogatives. The king's physicians became some of the most well-compensated medical professionals in Europe. not for treating illness, but for developing techniques and treatments that enhanced royal sexual performance. Dr. Jean-Baptiste Silva, who served as Louis's primary intimate health consultant for over 20 years, accumulated a fortune through his specialized services, developing potions, exercises, and medical procedures designed to maintain the king's legendary stamina well into his later years. Silva's private notes, discovered in family archives during the 20th century, reveal the extraordinary lengths to which royal medicine went to preserve Louis's sexual capabilities. The doctor developed a regimen of dietary supplements, physical exercises, and even primitive hormone treatments designed to ensure that age would not diminish the king's extraordinary gifts. These medical interventions, revolutionary for their time, came at enormous expense and required the services of specialists brought from across Europe. The king's appetite for sexual variety also drove innovations in what might charitably be called erotic technology. Court artisans developed increasingly sophisticated devices designed to enhance pleasure for both the king and his partners, creating a tradition of intimate craftsmanship that influenced French decorative arts for generations. These objects, hidden away in private collections, represent some of the finest examples of 18th century metalwork, woodworking, and textile arts, applied to the most intimate aspects of human experience. But perhaps the most significant impact of Louis's sexual obsessions was their effect on French society's attitudes toward sexuality itself. The king's open pursuit of pleasure, combined with his legendary capabilities, helped create a cultural environment where sexual sophistication was viewed as a mark of civilization rather than moral corruption. This shift in attitudes would influence French literature, art, and philosophy, contributing to the intellectual ferment that would eventually challenge traditional authority structures. The salons of Parisian society became venues for discussing not just politics and philosophy, but also the intimate arts that had been elevated to high culture through royal example. Women like Madame Geoffrin and Julie de Lespinasse hosted gatherings where the latest techniques for intimate pleasure were debated, alongside questions of governance and natural philosophy. The king's bedroom had become a laboratory for social experimentation that extended far beyond the palace walls. This cultural transformation created a generation of French intellectuals who viewed sexual freedom as inseparable from political liberty, a connection that would prove crucial during the revolutionary period. The same society that celebrated Louis's anatomical gifts would eventually turn those celebrations into weapons against royal authority, arguing that a king who pursued private pleasure at public expense had forfeited his divine right to rule. The international reaction to Louis's sexual reputation varied dramatically across European courts, revealing deep cultural differences in attitudes toward royal behavior. The Protestant courts of Northern Europe, particularly in England and Prussia, used Louis's lifestyle as evidence of Catholic moral corruption, creating propaganda that portrayed French monarchy as fundamentally degenerate. These attacks on Louis's character became tools of international diplomacy, allowing rival powers to claim moral superiority over France. Conversely, the Catholic courts of Southern Europe often viewed Louis's virility as evidence of divine favor, with Spanish and Italian nobles seeking marriages that would connect their bloodlines to the famously potent French king. Pope Benedict XIV, despite official church disapproval of Louis's extramarital activities, privately acknowledged that the king's extraordinary gifts might represent a form of divine blessing that transcended conventional moral categories. This international fascination with Louis's anatomy created an informal intelligence network devoted to tracking royal sexual activities. Foreign spies competed to provide their governments with detailed reports on the king's latest conquests, the performance of his various mistresses, and the innovations being developed to enhance royal pleasure. These reports, preserved in diplomatic archives across Europe, provide an unprecedented window into the intersection of intimate behavior and international relations. The king's relationship with the Catholic Church became increasingly complex as his sexual reputation grew. While church doctrine clearly condemned adultery and sexual excess, church officials found themselves in the impossible position of criticizing a monarch who claimed divine authority and whose sexual prowess seemed to validate claims of heavenly favor. This theological contradiction created internal conflicts within the French Church that weakened its moral authority and contributed to the secularization of French society. Cardinal Fleury, Louis's chief minister for much of his reign, attempted to find a middle ground that would preserve both royal prerogative and religious propriety. The cardinal developed what amounted to a theology of royal sexuality that distinguished between the king's public role as most Christian majesty and his private life as a man blessed with extraordinary physical gifts. This intellectual framework allowed church officials to maintain their support for the monarchy while avoiding direct confrontation with obviously problematic royal behavior. But even Fleury's diplomatic theology could not resolve the fundamental contradiction between Christian sexual morality and Louis's anatomical reality. The king's extraordinary endowment created practical problems that transcended religious doctrine, requiring solutions that often conflicted with church teaching. The development of contraceptive techniques to prevent unwanted royal pregnancies, the provision of medical care for women exhausted by royal attentions, and the financial support of numerous royal bastards all required church cooperation in activities that violated fundamental religious principles. The impact of Louis's sexual obsessions on French colonial policy provides another fascinating glimpse into how intimate royal behavior influenced global politics. The king's appointment of governors and administrators often depended more on their wives' availability for royal service than on their administrative capabilities. Several colonial disasters can be traced directly to Louis's practice of rewarding sexual access with political appointments, creating a global empire governed by men whose primary qualification was their willingness to share their spouses with their sovereign. The Louisiana Territory, New France, and French India all suffered from administrators chosen more for their domestic arrangements than their governing skills. Colonial rebellions and territorial losses often resulted from the incompetence of officials who owed their positions to their wives' intimate services rather than their own abilities. The king's bedroom politics had literally reshaped the global balance of power, contributing to French colonial decline and the rise of British imperial dominance. The economic cost of these sexual politics extended beyond direct expenditures to include the opportunity costs of misallocated resources and incompetent administration. French military defeats, failed colonial ventures, and diplomatic humiliations can all be traced, at least partially, to Louis's practice of subordinating policy decisions to sexual considerations. The same anatomical gifts that made the king a legend as a lover made him a disaster as a strategic leader. The development of what historians call petticoat politics during Louis's reign created a parallel government structure where real power flowed through intimate relationships rather than official channels. Madame de Pompadour's influence over foreign policy, military appointments, and financial decisions represented the institutionalization of sexual politics at the highest levels of government. Foreign powers learned to negotiate with the king's mistresses rather than his ministers, recognizing that access to royal pleasure was often more valuable than diplomatic protocols. This shadow government of royal mistresses created unprecedented opportunities for corruption and foreign influence. Enemy agents discovered that seducing the king's current favorite, or even gaining access to former mistresses, could provide intelligence and influence that traditional espionage could never achieve. the most intimate aspects of royal life had become national security vulnerabilities that foreign powers exploited with increasing sophistication. The training programs developed for women entering royal service represented another hidden cost of Louis's sexual system. The Parc aux Cerfs employed not just medical professionals and household staff, but also what amounted to a faculty of intimate education that rivaled the greatest universities of Europe in its sophistication and expense. These programs, designed to prepare young women for the unique challenges of satisfying royal appetites, created a specialized knowledge base that influenced European attitudes toward sexuality for generations. The curriculum at these facilities included not just physical preparation and medical training, but also instruction in literature, music, philosophy, and political affairs. Louis preferred his partners to be intellectually engaging as well as physically capable, creating a demand for educated courtesans that elevated the social status of women who might otherwise have remained in obscurity. Many graduates of royal training programs went on to establish their own salons and influence political affairs long after their intimate service to the crown had ended. This educational system created a class of women who understood power intimately, literally, and used that knowledge to influence French society in ways that extended far beyond the bedroom. Former royal mistresses became patrons of the arts, political advisors, and social reformers who applied lessons learned in intimate service to broader questions of governance and social organization. The king's sexuality had accidentally created a feminist intellectual movement that would eventually challenge the very system that created it. The medical advances developed to support Louis's sexual activities had implications that extended throughout European society. Techniques for treating intimate injuries, preventing unwanted pregnancies, and enhancing sexual performance spread from the royal court to the broader population, contributing to improvements in public health and personal satisfaction that benefited thousands of people who never directly encountered the king. Royal sexuality had become a driver of medical innovation that improved life for ordinary citizens. Dr. Silva's research into anatomy and sexual function, originally conducted to serve royal needs, laid important groundwork for later advances in gynecology, obstetrics, and sexual medicine. His detailed studies of female anatomy, motivated by the practical need to help women accommodate the king's extraordinary proportions, contributed to scientific understanding that would benefit women throughout Europe. The king's intimate problems had accidentally advanced medical knowledge in ways that transcended their original narrow purpose. The international marriage market for European nobility was permanently altered by Louis's reputation and its implications for future generations. Noble families began factoring potential intimate compatibility into marriage negotiations, seeking matches that would produce offspring capable of satisfying royal expectations. This led to a subtle eugenic program among European aristocracy, where anatomical considerations influenced dynastic planning in ways that would have seemed bizarre to earlier generations. The correspondence between noble houses during this period reveals an obsession with physical attributes that went far beyond traditional concerns about health and beauty. Families conducted discreet inquiries about the intimate capabilities of potential marriage partners, seeking to ensure that their daughters would be prepared for the unique demands of high-level court life. The king's extraordinary anatomy had created a new category of diplomatic consideration that influenced European politics for decades. As Louis aged and his legendary capabilities began to decline, the psychological impact on both the king and French society became increasingly apparent. The monarch, who had defined himself through sexual conquest, found himself facing the inevitable limitations of human biology, creating an identity crisis that affected his ability to govern effectively. The same appetites that had made him a legend were now making him a tragic figure, struggling against the constraints of mortality. The king's desperate attempts to maintain his sexual performance through increasingly dangerous medical interventions revealed the extent to which his identity had become dependent on his anatomical gifts. He submitted to experimental treatments, consumed dangerous substances, and even underwent primitive surgical procedures in futile attempts to preserve capabilities that nature intended to be temporary. These medical experiments, conducted in secret by royal physicians, represented some of the earliest attempts at what would now be called sexual enhancement therapy. The court's response to the king's declining powers created a climate of anxiety and uncertainty that affected every aspect of government function. Officials who had spent decades navigating the complex politics of royal sexuality found themselves unprepared for a monarch whose legendary appetites were no longer matched by legendary capabilities. The entire system of petticoat politics began to collapse as Louis's physical decline made his sexual relationships increasingly perfunctory and politically irrelevant. Foreign powers, sensing weakness in the French court, began adjusting their diplomatic strategies to account for a monarch whose most famous asset was no longer reliable. Marriage negotiations that had once centered on potential intimate relationships with the French king shifted toward more traditional political and economic considerations. Louis's anatomical decline had literally altered the balance of European diplomacy, creating opportunities for rivals who had long been overshadowed by French sexual superiority. The king's final years were marked by a desperate search for younger and younger partners, as if proximity to youthful vitality might restore his own declining powers. This pathetic quest led to increasingly inappropriate relationships that scandalized even the permissive French court, creating political liabilities that his enemies exploited with devastating effectiveness. The same sexual appetite that had once validated royal authority now undermined it, providing ammunition for critics who argued that the monarchy had become a corrupt institution devoted to satisfying one man's increasingly desperate desires. The revolution that would ultimately destroy the Bourbon dynasty drew much of its moral authority from the contrast between royal sexual excess and popular suffering. Revolutionary propagandists used detailed descriptions of Louis's intimate activities, often exaggerated for political effect, to illustrate the fundamental corruption of monarchical government. The king's anatomy, once a symbol of divine favor, became evidence of systemic moral decay that required radical political solutions. When the final accounting was done, Louis XV's reign had consumed not just enormous financial resources, but also the moral authority that had sustained French monarchy for centuries. His extraordinary anatomical gifts, pursued without restraint or wisdom, had created a political culture that prioritized private pleasure over public responsibility, personal satisfaction over national welfare, and short-term gratification over long-term stability. The most physically blessed king in French history had become the architect of his dynasty's destruction, proving that even divine gifts can become curses when wielded without wisdom or restraint. The legacy of Louis XV's anatomical obsessions extended far beyond his own death, influencing European culture, politics, and social development in ways that historians are still discovering centuries later. The sexual revolution that began in his court created intellectual and cultural movements that would reshape Western civilization, transforming attitudes toward authority, pleasure, and individual rights that continue to influence modern society. The king's bedroom had become the birthplace of ideas that would ultimately challenge every traditional institution in Europe. The philosophical implications of Louis's reign were explored most thoroughly by the generation of Enlightenment thinkers who witnessed its excesses firsthand. Voltaire, who spent considerable time at Versailles observing the king's behavior, used Louis's sexual appetite as a case study in the corruption of absolute power, arguing that unchecked authority inevitably led to moral degradation and political incompetence. The philosophers' critiques of royal sexuality became foundational texts for later revolutionary movements, providing intellectual justification for limiting monarchical power. Denis Diderot's contributions to the Encyclopédie included subtle but devastating analyses of royal sexual practices, using scientific language to expose the fundamental absurdity of a political system that elevated one man's anatomical accidents into divine mandates. Diderot's articles on anatomy, reproduction, and human sexuality drew heavily on observations of Louis's court, transforming intimate royal behavior into evidence for broader arguments about natural equality and the arbitrariness of social hierarchy. The Marquis de Sade, perhaps the most notorious intellectual influenced by Louis's example, developed his philosophical framework partly in response to what he saw as the hypocritical celebration of royal sexual excess, while ordinary citizens were punished for similar behavior. Sade's arguments for sexual liberation drew direct parallels between political and erotic freedom, contending that a society which tolerated unlimited royal pleasure while restricting ordinary sexuality was fundamentally corrupt and deserving of destruction. These philosophical responses to Louis's reign created an intellectual foundation for the revolutionary movements that would convulse Europe in the late 18th and early 19th centuries. The king's anatomical gifts had accidentally inspired a generation of thinkers who used sexual politics as a lens for understanding and challenging all forms of traditional authority. The bedroom had become a laboratory for political theory that would transform the Western world. The artistic legacy of Louis's sexual obsessions proved equally influential, inspiring new forms of erotic art that pushed the boundaries of acceptable expression while commenting on the relationship between power and pleasure. French painters like François Boucher and Jean-Honoré Fragonard developed artistic styles that captured the sensual atmosphere of Louis's court, while subtly critiquing the moral implications of royal excess. Their paintings, ostensibly celebrating beauty and pleasure, contained hidden messages about the corruption of power and the degradation of traditional values. The decorative arts flourished under royal patronage that was explicitly motivated by sexual considerations. Furniture makers developed increasingly elaborate and sensual designs intended to enhance intimate encounters, creating artistic movements that influenced European taste for generations. The famous Louis XV style, with its curves, gilt surfaces, and suggestive ornamentation, represented the aesthetic expression of a court obsessed with physical pleasure and sensual gratification. Even architecture was transformed by the king's sexual priorities, as palace designers developed new spatial concepts that balanced privacy with accessibility, creating environments that facilitated intimate encounters while maintaining royal dignity. The architectural innovations pioneered at Versailles influenced country house design throughout Europe, as nobles sought to recreate the atmospheric conditions that had made the French court legendary for its sexual sophistication. The literary impact of Louis's reign extended from court poetry, celebrating royal virility, to satirical works that used sexual metaphors to critique political authority. The emergence of what scholars call libertine literature reflected broader cultural changes that had originated in royal behavior, creating new genres of writing that explored the relationship between power, pleasure, and social organization. These literary developments would influence writers from Casanova to Byron, establishing erotic themes as legitimate subjects for serious artistic exploration. The scientific advances stimulated by royal sexual needs had implications that extended far beyond their original medicinal purposes, contributing to developments in anatomy, physiology, and what would eventually become psychology. The detailed studies of human sexuality conducted by royal physicians laid important groundwork for later scientific understanding of reproduction, sexual function, and the relationship between physical and mental health. Lewis's intimate problems had accidentally advanced human knowledge in ways that benefited all of society. The international transmission of French sexual culture, facilitated by diplomatic contacts and noble marriages, helped spread new attitudes toward intimacy throughout European society. Courts from Madrid to St. Petersburg began adopting French practices and perspectives, creating a continental culture of sexual sophistication that challenged traditional religious and social constraints. The king's anatomy had become a cultural export that influenced the intimate lives of millions of people across Europe. The economic systems developed to support royal sexuality created new forms of luxury commerce that persisted long after Louis's death, establishing France as the European center for products and services related to intimate pleasure. The expertise developed by French craftsmen in creating sophisticated erotic accessories influenced manufacturing and design in ways that extended far beyond their original sexual applications, contributing to France's reputation for luxury goods that continues to this day. The educational innovations pioneered in training royal companions had lasting effects on women's intellectual development, creating models for female education that emphasized both physical and mental cultivation. The programs developed at the Parc aux Cerfs demonstrated that women could master complex subjects and influence political affairs when given appropriate opportunities, providing examples that would inspire later feminist movements and arguments for women's intellectual equality. The political ramifications of Louis's sexual system continued to influence French governance long after the monarchy's fall, as revolutionary leaders struggled to create new forms of authority that could command respect without relying on divine sanction or sexual charisma. The collapse of royal sexual politics had created a vacuum that republican institutions found difficult to fill, contributing to the political instability that characterized post-revolutionary France. The international balance of power was permanently altered by the decline of French prestige associated with Louis's sexual excesses, creating opportunities for rival powers that had previously been overshadowed by French cultural dominance. The transformation of French sexuality from an asset into a liability contributed to broader shifts in European politics that would shape international relations for generations. The religious implications of Louis's reign extended beyond immediate theological controversies to influence broader questions about the relationship between temporal and spiritual authority. The Church's inability to effectively address royal sexual behavior without undermining monarchical legitimacy created precedents for the separation of religious and political power that would influence constitutional development throughout Europe. The psychological legacy of Louis's reign can be traced through the behavior of subsequent French rulers, who struggled to establish their authority without the sexual charisma that had characterized their predecessor. Louis XVI's notorious sexual difficulties and Marie Antoinette's desperate attempts to cultivate an aura of sensual sophistication reflected ongoing efforts to recapture the sexual mystique that had once made French royalty irresistible to European society. The medical records preserved from Louis's court continued to influence European understanding of sexual health and function well into the 19th century, providing data that informed later developments in gynecology, urology, and sexual therapy. The detailed observations made by royal physicians represented some of the earliest systematic studies of human sexuality, contributing to scientific knowledge that would benefit future generations. The architectural modifications made to accommodate Louis's sexual activities created new models for domestic design that influenced private residence construction throughout Europe, as wealthy families sought to recreate the spatial arrangements that had facilitated the legendary intimacies of the French court. The concept of the private apartment, with its emphasis on comfort, privacy, and sensual pleasure, represented a fundamental shift in European domestic architecture, that reflected changing attitudes toward personal life and intimate relationships. The diplomatic protocols developed to manage international relationships in the context of Louis's sexual reputation created new forms of cultural exchange that transcended traditional political boundaries. Foreign courts learned to navigate the complex intersection of personal and political relationships that characterized Versailles, developing skills in what might be called intimate diplomacy that influenced international relations long after the specific circumstances that created them had disappeared. The cultural production stimulated by royal sexual patronage created artistic and intellectual movements that continued to evolve long after their royal sponsor had died, establishing France as the European center for discussions of sexuality, pleasure, and the relationship between personal freedom and political authority. The king's anatomical gifts had accidentally launched cultural revolutions that would reshape Western civilization. The economic disruption caused by Louis's sexual expenditures contributed to fiscal crises that influenced the development of modern financial institutions and economic theory, as French administrators struggled to manage debts incurred through royal pleasure-seeking while maintaining essential government functions. The collision between royal appetites and fiscal reality provided case studies in economic mismanagement that informed later developments in public finance and budgetary planning. The social mobility created by royal sexual politics, where women could achieve influence through intimate service rather than birth or marriage, established precedents for merit-based advancement that challenged traditional aristocratic hierarchies. The success of women like Pompadour and du Barry in translating sexual access into political power demonstrated possibilities for social advancement that would inspire later movements for equality and individual achievement. The international marriage patterns influenced by French sexual culture created new forms of genetic mixing among European nobility that had long-term implications for the physical and mental characteristics of ruling classes throughout the continent. The emphasis on intimate compatibility in royal marriages, pioneered by responses to Louis's anatomical requirements, contributed to changes in aristocratic breeding patterns that influenced European genetics for generations. The technological innovations developed to enhance royal sexual performance stimulated advances in materials science, mechanical engineering, and what would eventually become industrial design, as craftsmen pushed the boundaries of their technical capabilities to meet the unique demands of royal intimacy. These innovations, originally created for highly specialized sexual applications, often found broader uses that contributed to general technological progress. The security arrangements required to protect royal sexual activities created new models for intelligence gathering and counterintelligence that influenced the development of modern espionage techniques, as French agents struggled to protect state secrets that were literally embodied in the king's anatomy, while foreign spies sought to exploit the vulnerabilities created by royal sexual behavior. The legal precedents established to manage the complex relationships created by royal sexual politics influenced the development of contract law, property rights, and what would eventually become family law, as French jurists struggled to create legal frameworks that could accommodate the unprecedented arrangements required by the king's sexual system. The philosophical questions raised by Louis's reign about the relationship between individual desire and social responsibility continued to influence European intellectual development long after the 17th century specific circumstances that generated them had disappeared, contributing to ongoing debates about personal freedom, political authority, and the proper role of government in regulating private behavior. As the palace guard completed his preservation work on that day in 1774, carefully sealing away the physical evidence of Louis XV's extraordinary anatomy, he was unknowingly preserving the material remains of a reign that had changed European civilization in ways that would continue to unfold for generations. The king's extraordinary member, hidden away in its sealed container, represented more than just a medical curiosity or historical artifact. It was the physical embodiment of forces that had transformed politics, culture, science, and society throughout the Western world. The irony was profound and inescapable. Louis XV had sought to use his anatomical gifts to validate his divine right to rule and to satisfy his personal appetites without regard for consequences. Instead, he had accidentally created intellectual, cultural, and political movements that would ultimately destroy the very system he had tried to embody. His pursuit of unlimited sexual pleasure had generated forces that challenged the legitimacy of unlimited power itself, creating ideas and institutions that would reshape European civilization in ways that the king himself could never have imagined. The preserved organ, locked away in its vault, would outlast the dynasty it had helped to destroy, the political system it had corrupted, and the cultural world it had transformed. In seeking to preserve the evidence of royal sexual supremacy, that palace guard had actually preserved a monument to the destructive power of unchecked appetites, the tragic consequences of absolute authority, and the terrible irony of gifts so extraordinary that they ultimately destroyed everything they touched. Louis XV had achieved the immortality he craved, but not in the form he had desired. His name would be remembered not as a great lover or a successful king, but as a cautionary tale about the dangers of allowing personal obsession to override public responsibility, individual appetite to supersede collective welfare, and anatomical accidents to determine political destiny. The most physically gifted monarch in European history had become history's most powerful argument against the concentration of unlimited power in the hands of any single individual, no matter how divinely blessed they might appear to be.